Welcome to our fourth and probably most important session of this resistance protest read, where we're talking about everyday acts of resistance. And if we're quietly honest with ourselves, there are few people more qualified to talk about this than working class Black women. And joining me this week are three creatives, women who have carved out a place for themselves, doing what they love and what they're so painfully good at, in spite of a political system designed explicitly to harm and exhaust them. But this isn't a protest chat about oppression itself. It's a protest chat about how these three incredible women and their communities survive and thrive. And for activists from all backgrounds, but especially those of us who grew up working class and politically disenfranchised, if we learn to listen, and I mean really hear, the stories and experiences of Black women, those who work alongside us, who live with us, our friends, our family members, we might be able to start resisting too. We might be able to help bring about change too. Because oppressors don't just decide one day to be good people. Change doesn't just happen because you feel entitled to it or because it's the right thing to do. So let's shut up and listen to the everyday acts of resistance practiced by Carleen Smith, Denise Headley, and Paige Cowan Hall. So the purpose of this protest read and our chat is first a celebration of hard-earned successes. So concessions won not out of the goodness of an oppressor's heart, but through sheer determination of those oppressed. And yeah, success isn't the only aspect of these acts of resistance that we need to talk about. So parts of these stories, intentionally, I assume, Carleen, that's something that you'll be able to give us more insight on. Parts of these stories really resonate today and they hit a bit harder than perhaps we'd like them to. So if we're up for that, I'd really like to sort of unpick some of these aspects.
I'm an author. I'm mother of two children, grandmother now. I work full-time as a training coordinator for a crazy company in Manchester. It doesn't give me enough time to write, actually. I used to work as a library assistant, which was fantastic because I was surrounded by books and it was quiet, but now I work for this mad company in Manchester. So I've written quite a few short stories, been lucky enough to have them published, mainly by Comma Press in Manchester. I've been writing probably from the age of 10, when I was sort of like encouraged by my teacher. So I've been writing a long time. And I'm now writing my fourth novel, which I've gone back to my old love, which is crime. And that novel's based in London. So that's me, really.
Carleen, Abby, and Paige, lovely to meet you. Carleen, it's an honor to be in the room with you. I've been writing, okay? If you could see my front room, it's not even a joke. Back there's pure journals. I had a journal when I was in my teens, from 14. So yeah. I'm looking at you and I'm drawing inspiration. I'm just channeling it now. So I'm Denise, okay? I'm a political commentator and I'm a broadcaster. I also work with mature people for a charity that looks after retired civil servants. I have a long history of politics, political engagement, sit-ins. This story resonated with me hugely because not that it's completely my era, but you know, you talked about some of the musicians, some of the Guyanese musicians, you talked about what's going on in Notting Hill, and I cried, by the way, as well. My heart was beating at certain bits. Generally, I do a political talk show every Friday called the Headley Headlight Show. So you can, you know, if you fancy dropping in on Twitter, it's quite a strong BIPOC space for women, but it's very political, and I have lots of interesting guests. And I think this week I've got that guy who's wrote Think Like a White Man. He's my guest this week.
I'm Paige. Again, lovely to meet you both. That sounds super interesting, Denise. So I'll definitely have a look at that. And yeah, Carleen, I love the story. It definitely hit hard. I actually really loved the ending. It weirdly reminded me of my short film. Like there's a little bit of hope, which is really important, I think, sometimes when talking about race and racial trauma. I think a lot of the time we don't get enough hope when discussing it. But I'm also a writer. I had my first short story published last year in an anthology called 11 Stories. I was the winner, which was very exciting. Yeah, I've been working on my first novel for a couple of years. I would love to have some advice about overcoming anxieties. You know, not
Yes.
writing block, but anxiety that causes you to not write. I'd love to have a chat with you guys about that.
Which is what I'm going through at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going through it at the moment.
We need to chat because it's probably the biggest blocker.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of my writing is, you know, as well as short stories and working on my novel. I've been writing some short film scripts as well. And hopefully my short film anthology, which is an interracial queer romance based in the 19th century, will get made in late spring next year. So I might actually do some more crowdfunding around that. So yeah, writer, but also work as a communications manager for a charity.
So I research protest. I'm writing my PhD on protest under authoritarianism, which for obvious reasons doesn't really include the UK, even though it perhaps should. So I'm really interested in how we can identify an event or something that happens as a political protest. And this can be complicated. So the vast majority of protest events sort of begin and end as this sort of spontaneous outpouring of frustration. So they're not necessarily organized in the sense of, you know, marching around with placards and street processions. Most of them don't even have sort of demands or any kind of policy aim in a specific sense. So when we look at 1958, you've got these teddy boys who've been engaging in state-sanctioned terrorism for years. Yet the events of 1958 are characterized as race riots rather than an act of resistance or political protest against this state-sanctioned violence. So when you were writing The Whistling Bird, did the events of 1958 feel like a protest to you? What was the sense of the time that you got, both from working with Dr. Kenny Monroe, and how does it sort of interact with your own experiences? Can you give us a bit of insight into that? It
wasn't portrayed as a protest. And I thought the way that I wanted the story to come across was that our people and people of my parents' generation simply had enough, and they were going to take matters into their own hands, and fight back. That's what I wanted to portray in the book, in the story. You know, they'd put up with so much for so long that something had to break, really.
This agency also really came through in the text, that there was sort of action and a decision.
There was action, and there was planned action. There was, especially the Jamaicans, they decided they'd had enough, and they were going to plan and plot and finally put an end to it all. Whereas, you know, sort of like the other people from other Caribbean islands, they were like, no, but Jamaicans were more fiery. And I decided I needed to put that in the story. They were the ones that were going to organize this combat, you know, to get things under control and just fight back.
I resonated with the frustration that people were feeling, because in terms of the story, it's not of my era, because I was born in the 70s, but the legacy of that continued violence was something that I personally experienced in my lifetime. So it wasn't unusual. Resistance wasn't just about the protest. The resistance was their everyday experience, because they couldn't get housing. They set up partner. They couldn't get jobs, or they couldn't get particular types of opportunities. They did things internally. They set up restaurants. They set up places where they could go so they could feel relaxed, or they could not be attacked. So to me, the agency came from the fact that they just were trying to survive. Violence was an experience that everyone knew about. It happened at your place of work. It happened at school, on your way home. It was a spontaneous act, yes, but it was an act for saying, you know, we have to survive. Otherwise, we're going to die in this place.
And as I understand it as well, Kelso Cochrane, he hasn't got justice yet. Is that right? I read as of 2021, he hadn't. Is that still true today?
Yeah.
So there you go. We're looking at 60 years after the event, and there's still no justice. That violence is still being perpetuated, not only in the justice system, but also in the streets and the everyday, as you said, sort of these everyday acts of resistance, this constant, not protest necessarily in the formal sense of the word, but this everyday act of resistance.
Resistance in this sense, maybe not protest is a better word, is so often seen as an impromptu event, but is often when you've got no other course of action available to you through policy or inaction. from government, or from, in this instance, particularly the police, because they definitely said on multiple occasions, we've told them this problem, we've told them what's occurring, and they do nothing, or they punish us. And so you can kind of see when people deride more aggressive forms of resistance or protest, there's never seems to be the underlying understanding where you've exhausted avenues through democratic and legal processes, and then you're left with nothing else except for to either give in or to act. It was an exhaustive process that they had tried over and over again. Yeah. And ultimately what you said, Denise, was really powerful about that they had, you know, they formed their own loans, or they formed their own spaces. And even in that story, and let's be real, in reality, that community space of safety was sabotaged by white supremacy, by the Teddy Boys, so that even the small space of safety wasn't actually safe. That was an illusion of safety to an extent, because if your country and the people around you aren't protecting you, then there is no safe space. Your home becomes a place of danger, essentially. And you know, what recourse are you given but to protest? It actually really reminded me about the pulling down of the statue in, was it Bristol? I'm pretty sure I remember reading people saying that it had been flagged already. And again, I'm not condoning vandalizing or dangerous protests in any way, but people pointed out that this point had been raised before, that they were like, this is damaging for us to be venerating a slave owner. We want it taken down, and those petitions were not listened to. So at a certain point, your only option is that you have to accept, or it's going to become more aggressive in some way. And failure to acknowledge the lead up to acts like that is, I think, probably intentional actually, but also sad.
The violence and the acts of resistance. I went back to page 278 when it talked about Alfonso arriving. He accepted that he couldn't be the man he was in Jamaica. That is violence. That's the violence of every day. He was driving the train for the lawyers and all of the individuals who he could have by any means been that way. And that's a continual experience. So the resistance was born out of not just that, the physical violence, the state sanctioned terrorism, it was born out of an everyday violence of oppression.
My granddad was, I think he was like the head of maths or something, a department in Jamaica at secondary schools. He's a very clever man, very intelligent, and he came to the UK and he could not get that job teaching for love nor money. It's basically being told that you're not good enough and you're stupid, despite whatever qualifications you've gotten, which as a British colony should have been respected and usable. And I never thought about that as an act of violence, but it's one of the acts of violences impact your future, your generational wealth, your opportunities. It's probably in some ways more painful in the long run than a brick through a window, what it can do to your sense of self, I think, and also how it did impact the Black community in regards to our opportunities and generational wealth that we could accumulate.
When a lot of people from the Caribbean came to this country, they were middle class. They were landowners. They had their own homes. They didn't necessarily had a welfare system, but they had a network of welfare support. They were farmers. They were self-sufficient, and they came over here, and they then became the at the very bottom of the social ladder. And that in itself, like Paige was saying, and Carleen captured so well in this book, is part of the continued violence, because only now we actually recognize the data sets for inequality. It never used to happen before, because first of all, nobody was collecting it. And now you look at those health inequalities, like let's say with, postnatal care, prenatal care, Black women's experience in maternity. And it's only because there is a drive to look at things. And I think that actually came in under Theresa May. She was the person who said, look, we want public bodies to start monitoring outcomes, and we want it stratified along certain lines. And that's why we got to this.
I think it's more than just that, though. I think there's so much pushback when health policy charities target Black people directly. I think our health is politicized.
So let's come back a bit to the story, sort of the issue of identifying this event as a protest and more as sort of like a continued act of resistance. So one aspect of this is looking at how the government responds then to acts of resistance and protest. And what we call concessions when we're studying protest is where the government gives protesters what they want and need. This almost never happens during the act of resistance. This is almost never a direct response to an act of protest or an act of resistance. Often it takes years. So we didn't see any formal national anti-discrimination legislation in the UK until like 6-7 years after the events of Notting Hill. So the response can often be really delayed. And it's quite difficult to decide whether or not an act of resistance was successful in a sense or not. So what I'd like to ask all of you in turn is, do you consider the Notting Hill riots, if you consider them an act of popular resistance, do you consider them successful? What does this legacy feel like?
I've lived through the 70s, obviously, and the 80s and the 90s, and basically not a lot has changed. For me, not a lot of has changed. There may be sort of like a few changes here and there, but if you think about 1958, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't that long ago, you know, and we're still having to just fight for basic justice. I was denied a place at university, mainly because I was told that as a Black female, there wouldn't be a place for me in film. So I've seen changes only because we've come about them, because we've stood up and, you know, we've become more confident. But in terms of, if we're talking about government policies, I don't see anything at all.
That's exactly the point, isn't it? It's that these concessions don't come because of a benevolent government or a benevolent oppressor. They come because people work bloody hard to make change happen. People who are oppressed work bloody hard to make change happen. And the response from above doesn't necessarily follow those changes.
I'm not in full agreement with Carleen from the perspective that I think advances have been made in certain areas and in particular spaces. In terms of our cultural tapestry, if we put it that way, there is a much greater interest and acceptance and willing to back commercially products, don't mean to be so base, but products that encapsulate people's experience, or authors being put forward who come from marginalized groups. I think you've got more of an appetite in film. I'm not saying it's completely where we want it to be, but I think there's more of an appetite in film for stories that don't just keep giving you, you know, the same storyline with the same characters based on the same cultural ideas and thoughts and that thing. So I think in the cultural space, there have been advancements. I think you have had in many instances politically, especially brown faces in high places. You know, everyone got upset about Windrush after the fact. However, during the period of Windrush, let's not forget that there was a lot of support for Windrush, and we didn't have a great deal of political noise from who we would have expected to have political noise from. I served as a councillor for 12 years. I was able to affect my things locally. I had other women from the Cameroons, from Nigeria, from not so much Caribbeans. There were a couple of Caribbeans, but not as many. But they were able to do things in their community. So I think that was there. In terms of the legacy with the policing, we have to accept that Doreen Lawrence made massive strides. It doesn't mean it's fixed. Doesn't mean that trust is there. We've got a new commissioner in London, I think his name is Rawnsley, and he is now talking about and accepting, unlike Cressida Dick, right? He's accepting that the police are racist, homophobic, they have misogynist issues, they are classist, they are abuses of power. So I don't necessarily share the view that it hasn't changed. There has been change, in my opinion.
Especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter, there has been a big push for Black voices. How much of that is related to commercialization, and what the longevity of that is, I'm less certain. And I would say that there has been some pushback and backlash from certain aspects of the population about the amount of Black voices in media. but I would say that I've seen a change. We talked about how, you know, we're not being deterred, younger generations, things happening at a grassroots community level. But isn't that what was happening when Colleen set this story? And maybe that will always be the way, that community and activism is always driven by us. And I think part of that was that we didn't want to have to keep driving it. We want it to be a policy entrenched. And it's not that there aren't any changes. I would say that the race report that came out was a pretty big slap. There have been steps forward, but I can also feel that there's been a lot of pushback. And I don't feel like that pushback, maybe it doesn't have the same violence, physical violence that it did when this was set around the Notting Hill Riots, but policy and general pushback I think is still pretty heavy. And I would say that whilst it's inspirational that, you know, younger people and communities are still pushing forward, I would say that's what they were doing already.
We spoke to Rob Page last week a little bit about the act of protest as a general point. And what he said is that things always go backwards and forwards. It's always a negotiation rather than a straightforward progress from here to something better. And that seems like what you're saying there, Paige, this negotiation, which is a lot of work. I think of the emotional labor that goes into negotiating a work contract or a job or something. And to have that as part of your everyday life, this everyday negotiation between yourself and the state, that's a really huge amount of work for individuals and communities to be doing. Instead of having the state doing its job, you've got essentially civil society groups stepping up and being like, okay, we've got a need, we need to fulfill it. And that, again, is a negotiation process. It comes back to, Denise, what you were saying about these everyday acts of resistance, this constant resistance, rather than just one explosion of protest.
And it's annoying, you know? Not every day you want to be checking people. And it's like, you know, I was out with my family, and someone says something, and do I want to deal with it then?
To the work system.
Tiring. It's so tiring. Sorry, Paige, go on.
Oh, that's okay. I think I had a real moment where kind of the emotional toil of like encountering racism kind of really came to me. I was kind of, no one was pressured, but some people were sharing their experiences of racism. And because it was so pushed as this American problem, I thought it was really worth sharing some of the instances where I'd encountered it, even in fact directly outside the door of my workplace. Like a few months prior, someone had like racially abused me after a sports day that I'd had at work, which was really lovely. I have this habit of whenever I've debated about race or issues that impact racism or racial encounters that I've had, I've always been so careful to stick to facts, to never raise my voice, to never show emotion, to really talk it through, to hear the other person, even if it's a little bit racist, and to just consistently, eloquently debate and constantly control my emotions, because I've always found that the best way to get my point across. And then when I was recounting just the sheer number of just like racial encounters I'd experienced outside, on the bus, on the tube, work, you know, when I recounted them, I started to tear up and cry. And it's like, my whole life, I've realized that even when someone's been racist to my face, I don't react. I kind of walk forward and pretend it hasn't happened. And I never really acknowledged the trauma of being racially abused. And then I did, and I was like, oh, this is horrible. I think that's like, someone's talked about like kind of like a black tax on emotion of having to deal with racism. And even in my writing, I was saying to Abby, it accidentally infiltrates when I write all the time. You know, I just wanted to write a drama that was just like, everyone is happy. It's like a happy romance between this black woman and this white woman, you know, and they're just happy. And then I was like, no, they are, but there has to be an element of reality. And it ended up actually becoming me expressing, I think, some of the microaggressions that I'd actually experienced myself just in a 19th century setting. And it's so hard getting people to understand what that is actually like.
Often, like you're saying, we do repress those emotions, and it is painful. and it's traumatizing, and it actually affects your body. It's important. And we're in a space, and that's one of the things I like about my space. I don't have anyone come into my space and they don't have to convince me of the reality of their life. And that's often what happens. You have to get someone to accept your reality. And even coming back to the story, the pushback was, your reality doesn't exist. These families were the victim of terrorism. Yeah, they were being terrorized in their homes. The Notting Hill Riots then led to Critchlow and the Mangrove Nine. The Mangrove Nine then basically put the Magna Carta in front of people. They argued with the same place that you had to go to, Paige. They had to be, and we all have to go to, if we're Black women, we have to control our emotions, and not we worry about the feelings of white people. If you don't worry about the feelings of the police, yeah, trust me, you're getting pepper sprayed. So this is what I'm saying. It's about that constant, always having to manage it. You're always having to think about how they feel, you know, and I can't show them that I feel bad about it.
Like the fact that historically it's referred to as the Notting Hill Riots, that sounds like there's some sort of equal footing.
Yeah.
The white supremacists that were attacking them and the Black people that were reacting to it. I was like, that is not a race riot. This is the oppression of a people physically, violently, as well as in a policy way, and then reacting in defense of themselves. That's not a race riot.
You're living in the UK, you're always going to have to interact with white people, whether at work or like in the story, in personal relationships. And Paige has obviously just written her queer period drama with an interracial relationship, more as sort of an advice sharing perhaps between each other and different generations. How do you protect yourself individually as Black women in the UK? And has this changed as you've gotten older and wiser, and perhaps as the environment has changed or your own sort of methods have changed? How do you personally deal with this?
So in regards to the short film, one of the things that I kind of wrote into being key to their relationship was, there's like a line where Jen, who's the Black woman, says to Penny, the white woman, if they're going to be together, she says, I need you to see the world. I can't show it to you, and I need you to see it as it is. And to me, that's coming from a place of, you shouldn't have to constantly educate or explain, whether you're with a white partner, Asian, whoever your partner is, you shouldn't have to constantly educate and explain to them what it is like to deal with racism. At a certain point, they have to just be willing to learn and understand and be a safe space for you. It does come from a place, if you've been in those situations, not just in interracial relationships, but in as in like romantic ones, but in platonic ones with friends and stuff like that. Having to educate is an exhausting task in and of itself. And with your friends and family and loved ones, that's probably not always the space where you're going to want to do that. And so I think that was a key part of, if they're going to be together, at the very least, that beginning of understanding from her white partner was pretty key for her mental health sanity. In regards to maintaining my mental health, I've actually just started to occasionally step away from conversations about race when I'm not in the space or the mood to talk about it. Sometimes people raise subjects and I'll just sip my drink and then I'll get up and I'll go and read a book.
For me, being my age, you know, I'm not far off from 60. I've been through a lot in my life, and I'm at the stage in my life where I'm looking for peace. I kind of got involved in social media from 2016 because I realized as a creative, you need social media to, you know, drive certain things. And going on Twitter can be just like so much conversations going on and so many opinions about race. If you don't take yourself away from that mentally, it will drive you mad. It will really drive you mad. So like you, Paige, I do that. I have days where I just disengage from it because it's so painful and torturous, dealing with everyday life and situations. And on top of it, you've got to deal with that. And, you know, you've got to hear it and you see scenes flash up on social media. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going mad or if I'm overthinking things. You know, like I was telling you about the situation at work. I'm in work sometimes and conversations are flying around about immigrants and they're just really ignorant conversations. And I put my AirPods in. I put them in. I silence it. I've had years of, you know, running through the park away from the skinheads and on the bus by football fans. It's a trauma. It really is a trauma. And nobody can understand what that is until you're affected by it. So to try and explain it to people, how do you explain that to people? You know, what it's like to get up every day and just wonder if it's because of your skin color, somebody's giving you an odd look in, you know, in a bar, or, you know, and it's sometimes it's the subtle racism. I think that's the worst. I'd rather somebody call me a name or whatever, you know, you can deal with it. But that sort of underhanded, subtle racism that we have to face from day to day can drive you mad. So yeah, from day to day, you know, to protect my mental health, I'll just disengage from it.
One of the key things I do is I set up things for myself, because I can't be sacked from my own project unless I sack myself. And I often find that me as a particular type of Black woman, I'm not going to get through. I've been blocked primarily because of those characteristics. I feel like you're pushing against white supremacy, okay? You know, you push against it in every annal of your life. And when you're trying to explain to people about the damaging impact of white supremacy, how it actually is, it's not just physically damaging, it's mentally damaging, it's damaging at a genome level, and that stuff is transported. So I have to make certain choices. You know, I'm a parent, I raise my children in a particular way, and I said to them, you know what, you're English. When I grew up, I was like, oh, I'm not English. And I said, no, you're English. You know why? Because take what's yours from this place.
Denise, you talk about the younger generation being entrepreneurial and being more adaptive and just going out and doing things. I think that's just you. Like, this describes you. It's nothing to do with the younger generation. I think,
oh, darling, you're very generous, darling. Thank you.
No, I'm serious. Like, I'm not meaning it as a compliment. I'm meaning it as an observation, objective observation right here. Like, you have created so many spaces, not just for you, not just for other BIPOC women, not just for people from your own community. You've created spaces for so many politically disenfranchised people. And Colleen, also your work, your book has resonated not just with us in this group chat, but I don't know if you've been looking on social media. There's also people who are resonating with this from either Black communities in the UK or from outside. You know, you are creating spaces, both of you, not coming from the millennial generation, not being Gen Z. You are creating these spaces.